Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. March was Women's History Month and I really took this opportunity to focus my reading on women's fictions. Most of what I read either feature a female protagonist or were written by female authors, with very few exceptions. I mostly read novels this month with one short story anthology collection. So I will start this wrap up from the 19th century classic novels, which are currently in the public domain, and I will leave you links to Project Gutenberg or to a volunteer contributed audiobook on LibriVox so you can read these works for free. And then I will move on to contemporary fiction, which are also very enjoyable, very exciting. Let's take a look at the books. Madame Bovary by Gustav Flaubert. The word novel doesn't really do this work justice. I want to describe it as a dream. This masterpiece is written with language that is so beautiful, so sentimental, that I think every sentence can just be savored for the beauty of it. You can enjoy this book like you would a poetry collection. Just keep it at hand and occasionally flip through it and just appreciate individual passages for the beauty of the language itself. You can read this by candlelight with Ravel or Debussy playing in the background and just enjoy the romance of that action. This novel is about Emma, who married Charles Bovary but was very unsatisfied with her married life. Being young and beautiful, she loves books, she loves music, and she dreams of the adventure and passion that she often reads about in novels, but struggles to find that in the provincial life that she leads. She dreams of life in a different place, Paris in particular, and she dreams of being with different men and finding the kind of love and passion that she often reads about in stories. Her ill-fated romantic escapades may have been the central plot of this book, but I really thought the author's focus was on her reveries, her dreams, her fantasies and imaginations, and how beautiful they were. In fact, what drew me into this character's psyche was not her desire for the particular love interests that she had. In fact, I personally did not find those men appealing, but it was how palpable the sense of ennui and mundaneness of her life is, and by contrast, how free she is in her imagination and in her daydreams, in her fantasies. Picking this book up as a 21st century working class woman, I did not expect to find anything relatable in a 19th century upper middle class French woman's extramarital affairs. But I do think that there is something universal and something inherently human about wanting to break out of the constraints of your daily life, of seeing the limitations of your home life or your work or your town and wanting something more, something bigger, something more exciting. It's that constant urge to break free, and how beautifully the author writes about it, that will keep this novel in my memory for quite a long time. And I think as of now, it's very high up on the list of my favorite classic literature of all time. I don't think whatever language I use to describe this work can be nearly as beautiful as the author's. So please allow me to read you a few passages from this dreamy masterpiece. She loved the sea only for its storms, and greenery only when it grew up here and there among ruins. She needed to derive from things a sort of personal gain, and she rejected as useless everything that did not contribute to the immediate gratification of her heart. Being by temperament more sentimental than artistic, in search of emotions and not landscapes. In her desire, she confused the sensual pleasures of luxury with the joys of the heart, elegance of manner with delicacy of feeling. Didn't love, like a plant from India, require a prepared soil, a particular temperature? Sighs in the moonlight, long embraces, tears flowing over hands yielded to a lover, all the fevers of the flesh and the languors of tenderness, thus could not be separated from the balconies of great chateaux filled with idle amusements. a boudoir with silk blinds, a good thick carpet, full pots of flowers, and a bed raised on a dais, nor from the sparkle of precious stones and shoulder knots on servants' livery. Deep in her soul, however, she was waiting for something to happen. Like a sailor in distress, she would gaze out over the solitude of her life with desperate eyes, seeking some white sail in the mists of the far-off horizon. She did not know what this chance event would be, what wind would drive it to her, what shore it would carry her to, whether it was a longboat or a three-decked vessel loaded with anguish or filled with happiness up to the portholes. But each morning, when she awoke, she hoped it would arrive that day, and she would listen to every sound, spring to her feet, feel surprised that it did not come. Then, at sunset, always more sorrowful, she would wish the next day were already there. Not only was the whole book written with such beautiful language that it can just be appreciated as a poetry collection, the author also does this very interesting thing where at the end of every chapter he would conclude it with a sudden turn of events that you couldn't help but immediately jump into the next chapter. I think way before the uprising of the crime fiction and thrillers, this was kind of the OG cliffhanger at the end of every chapter type of book. I don't know if there are many other examples from the same time period. I would be very interested to find out and pick up another one just like it. Even with all this light, dreamy, beautiful, fantastical language, this story is a tragedy, and it did make me cry in the end, which is just another reason why this story will probably stay with me for quite a long time. And I wouldn't be surprised if I would often feel the urge to revisit this book just to savor some of the individual passages, just to re-experience the beauty of that language. Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This novel was written by the youngest of the Brontë sisters. You might know Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë and Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. This one is one of the lesser known and lesser read works of the Brontë sisters. It follows Agnes Grey, who set out to make her own way in the world as a governess at the young age of 19 after her family fell into poverty. She first became the governess with the Bloomfields, where the children were quite young, casually cruel, and very careless. She was later blamed for the children's lack of improvement in their temperament and dismissed. But she was undeterred by this and found another post with the Murrays. The Murray children were slightly older, but not more virtuous than her previous charges. They were rather vain and insolent and capricious, and the whole household did not treat Agnes with a lot of respect. Despite the difficulties of her work, she found some solace by going to church, and there she met the curate, Mr. Weston. She slowly became drawn to him, but what ensued was a series of longing and trials, partly brought upon by the capricious nature of the Murray sisters. What really impressed me about this heroine, Agnes Grey, is how firmly she upheld her principles and her dignity despite how people treated her. She was never immodest, never arrogant, but she was confident in her conduct. And she refused to bow to the demands of those richer and more powerful than her. I read this as a morality tale, and I found it heartwarming despite the bleak, cold, English seaside Moorish landscape. I did find that the language of this writing is very reserved and at certain points of the dialogue felt a little bit pedantic. So this was in strong contrast with Madame Bovary, which I also just finished, which had very lavish, dreamy, poetic language and description of series of reveries and fantasies. This book certainly places a much heavier emphasis on piousness and modesty. So after a very passionate French tale, this kind of felt like a cup of herbal tea after a very rich dessert. I do think that this novel places a stronger focus on the moral lessons that it's trying to teach than placing twists and turns in the plot. I do think that you will find this heroine really likable and really sympathizable, and I do hope that you enjoy reading about her experience wrangling difficult children, trying to maintain her friendships, and also navigating a young person's first experience with romance. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by M. Brontë. So I read this one right after finishing Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë, and I think I can safely say that I prefer the plot and the writing of this book by quite a lot to Agnes Grey. So this book follows young Gilbert Markham and is mostly told through a first-person perspective in the voice of Gilbert Markham. A very young and beautiful lady called Helen Graham moves into Wildfell Hall. She has a very young son called Arthur, and people all over town start noticing her because, she's the newcomer and she is very lovely, but she is in fact quite reclusive. She doesn't really seek out Gilbert and his friends' company quite a lot, even though they are peers, and there really isn't much more to do in the Moorish seaside town in 19th century England. So Helen is often seen wearing light mourning, so people assume that she had a husband before, but he has passed away. However, they had difficulty finding out who he is, and Helen seemed quite adamant in keeping her existence and her lodging in Wildfell Hall a secret from her previous friends, just wherever her friends back home were before she moved here. And in addition to that, she paints and sells her paintings to support herself, which is considered, I guess, a little bit unusual in mid-19th century. Just the idea of a lady earning her own living by working by the labor of her hand instead of an inheritance of some sort, I guess, is quite unusual back in that time. And while Gilbert is slowly falling for her beauty and her rather cold mystique, people started circulating rumors that her son, Arthur, kind of bears a resemblance to her landlord at Wildfell Hall. And this really got the rumor mill churning, and you very soon find public opinions turning against her, and even Gilbert started having doubts. But soon Helen handed him her diary, and through Gilbert reading this diary, we find out exactly what happened to Helen before, why she is in the situation that she is in, why she made such a choice, which is very unconventional for her class and for her time. I loved this protagonist. I adored how introverted she was. I found that very relatable. But in addition to that, I feel like she really demonstrated what it means to pursue one's happiness and what it means to make choices that follow her own heart while also upholding her moral principles despite other people who have failed her or people who have betrayed her, and making choices that really challenged social norm of the time. So I guess in that regard, in her self-confidence and self-assertiveness, she is a little bit similar to Agnes Grey, but I did find this story much less of a slightly pedantic morality tale. And not just because Helen dared to leave the situation that she was in, make her own way in the world, regardless of what other might think of her. I think in this story, the author made a very daring demonstration of what it means for a woman to decide for herself what is right, what is the right thing to do, how she can pursue her freedom with a clear conscience, regardless of what other people might think of her choice with regard to social norms or views of women's role in a marriage. I did see a little bit of history of Anne Bronte's sister, Charlotte Brontë, who wrote Jane Eyre, trying to prevent this book being reprinted and republished after Anne's death because she thought it was a little bit too unconventional and she was worried what that would do to her sister's reputation and her lasting legacy. So I guess that should tell you how ahead of its time and groundbreaking this work is in mid-19th century that dares to tell the story of a woman who pursues her own happiness. So out of all the Brontë sisters' works, if you have already read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, out of Anne Bronte's works, I would recommend The Tenant of Wildfell Hall over Agnes Grey. White Fang by Jack London. I just finished reading this and it has already become one of my favorite books of all time. So this was my choice for a cold, snowy winter kind of reading, and the author did a brilliant job at exactly that. However, if you have the same edition that I have, it is the Watermill Classic that's printed in 1980. Don't trust the synopsis on the back because this synopsis made it seem like Scott, the human, is like the main protagonist. He doesn't actually show up until about the last quarter of the story. This story is told mostly from the perspective of White Fang, who is a wolf dog. So his mother is a dog and his father is a wolf. And we learn about a little bit of his family history in the first part of the story that was actually told from the perspective of the humans that encountered his mother. And we follow his journey that mostly takes place in the frozen wild. So this is really a coming-of-age story of a wolf dog, if you can imagine that. When we're first introduced to White Fang, he is literally just a newborn puppy. We just see this adorable little gray cub that's kind of a slightly different color from all of his brothers and sisters. And as much as we want to see him just immediately being adopted into a loving home and receiving warmth and many cuddles, he actually goes through a fair amount of hardship because this is a wolf dog that's born in the wild, and he had to deal with all of the snow and the scarcity of resources and the fact that food is very, very hard to find. So you have to kind of really fight for the right to survive. And throughout this story, we really see how the environment shapes White Fang, from things that he had to fight for, his interactions with other animals who are similarly dealing with this kind of scarcity, to different human beings who treat him in very different ways, and how he responded and how he learned human malice as well as human kindness later on in the story. I really did think of this story as a hero's journey where you see this incredible character overcoming a lot of obstacles and then finding meaning and finding identity. If you find it difficult to believe that there would be that level of complexity and character development in a dog, you should read this book because the writing is so detailed and so compelling that you really feel this character's growth. I think I can just read you the very beginning of this story and convince you to pick it up because the writing is so gorgeous. Chapter 1, The Trail of the Meat. Dark spruce forest frowned on either side of the frozen waterway. The trees had been stripped by a recent wind of their white covering of frost, and they seemed to lean toward each other, black and ominous, in the fading light. A vast silence reigned over the land. The land itself was a desolation, lifeless, without movement, so lone and cold that the spirit of it was not even that of sadness. There was a hint in it of laughter, but of a laughter more terrible than any sadness, a laughter that was mirthless as the smile of the Sphinx, a laughter cold as the frost and partaking of the grimness of infallibility. It was the masterful and incommunicable wisdom of eternity laughing at the futility of life and the effort of life. It was the wild, the savage, frozen-hearted Northland wild. So the cold and frozen wild really comes to life under Jack London's pen. And throughout reading this story, you really feel like you can see every single character, every single human and animal that he is depicting. They are so vivid and so lifelike. So please pick up White Fang by Jack London. This will be a fantastic read. Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. I actually slightly disagree with the title because the story and the social issues that are contained in this very tiny volume is anything but small. When you see the dedication page where the author says that this story is dedicated to the women and children who suffer time in Ireland's mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries, Keep that in mind because this will become very relevant very quickly in the story. The protagonist, Bill Furlong, is a coal and timber merchant. He is a middle-aged man that kind of came from humble beginnings. He never knew who his father was, and he and his mother were essentially sheltered by like a very rich widow called Mrs. Wilson. So we meet him during Christmas time, and he and his family go through all of these celebratory routines. But in the meantime, he started having these kind of doubts and feelings of uncertainty. And while he was making a delivery, he discovers a very dark secret hidden in his local community and kind of hidden right in the religious authority that kind of has almost absolute power over the small town. I'm trying to not give away too many spoilers because I really want you to read this story for yourself. At the beginning, it kind of seems like a great Christmas tale with this very heartwarming writing and all the niceties between human beings. But once you realize the big theme, the big secret that's hidden in here of exploitation, of religious hypocrisy, it's kind of really astounding how the writer can just weave all of these things together and craft such a concise tale that you can't stop thinking about. And I am definitely interested in checking out more works from the same author. Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is a story of jealousy and plagiarism that offers many tongue-in-cheek critiques of the publishing industry while slowly descending into madness. So the protagonist of this story is called Jupiter Son Hayward, and she goes by June Hayward. June and her friend Athena Liu are both graduates from Yale University, and they both became authors. But June is not nearly as successful as Athena. June's first novel kind of flopped pretty badly, but Athena became an instant publishing industry darling. So then one day when they were celebrating Athena getting a Netflix deal, Athena accidentally choked on a pancake and died. However, she left behind a manuscript that was finished. It's called The Last Front, where Athena, being Chinese American, she wrote about Chinese laborers that were recruited by the British Army during World War I, where they kind of contributed to the war effort, but they were very much discriminated and mistreated. So in the chaos of Athena's death, June took this manuscript from her apartment and decided to just take it as her own. So June kind of polished and added to the existing script and started passing this off as a novel that she wrote. So instead of June Hayward, which was the pen name on her first novel, she adopted the new pen name Jupiter Son. So Son being her middle name, but also it could be interpreted as a Chinese last name. So she reached out to agents, editors, and publishers, and they started publishing and selling The Last Front with the name Jupiter Son attached to it with no mention of Athena Liu at all. So this novel started selling very well, but a lot of people started questioning Jupiter or June's ethnic identity and whether she was the rightful person to tell this story. While her and her team are trying to deal with all of this criticism, there is an anonymous accusation of plagiarism that started circulating on Twitter, and it kind of went viral all over social media. So while all of this is unfolding in the form of a social media rage war and June's kind of doom-scrolling spiral, the author gives us a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes look at the publishing industry and kind of how the marketing gears actually turn. One of the things that this novel very shrewdly points out is that a lot of the times bestsellers are chosen before the book even hit the market. A lot of interviews and puff pieces are arranged by publishing houses in major newspapers and websites and blogs. So the works of certain authors would be cherry-picked and promoted, while others kind of fall by the wayside. Later on in the narrative, the author points out another issue in the publishing industry, which is that a lot of minority writers are kind of pigeonholed by publishing houses based on their ethnic identity. So the publishing industry would see and market a certain author of a certain heritage as someone who is kind of a token of that group. And everything they write needs to be talking about the oppression and the marginalization of that group. So not only does it make it very difficult for those authors to break out of just writing about their ethnic identity, it also creates this sense of quota and competition within that group. For example, publishing houses would say, oh, we already have an Asian author, or we already have a Muslim author, and just turn other applicants down. But while publishing houses are kind of virtual signaling by very heavily promoting minority authors, it also makes other authors see this as favoritism towards minority authors. So it creates a very bizarre and strange and unfair competition for everyone. In addition to that, this novel also takes a look at cancel culture and how easy it is to incite people into a social media rage war and just join this piling on against a certain target without really caring about the truth or nuance or balance or critical thinking. People kind of just want to express anger in a lot of situations. And how quickly and how easily it is to turn the tide of opinions from one extreme to the other. And perhaps adding one irony to another, all of this polarized rage war scandal stuff is adding more sales to the books that are being discussed. And behind all of these madness, the author is also very honest about the vulnerability of the act of writing and the insecurity of writers, especially when facing with the uncertainty of a writing career and just the grinding gears of the publishing industry. It's kind of a sad truth how much June genuinely loves writing. You can see that passion every time she throws herself back into her project, whether it's just polishing up the manuscript that she stole or trying to come up with something of her own and failing. You see that writing genuinely brings her joy, and it is a bit sad that her family doesn't appear to support her in pursuing a writing career, which is probably a shared truth among many authors. I think the author did a pretty good job of keeping the reader engaged, keeping you turning pages, finding out what happens next, despite the narrator being unreliable and unlikable. And I do think this novel has a self-aware, self-deprecating kind of element, especially when R.F. Kuang is alluding to whether a writer of a certain ethnicity can be appropriating their own culture, especially if they don't speak the language well, or if they learned about the culture and history of their people as an immigrant in another country and they study these subjects in a foreign language. I think this is actually one of the more unique and more nuanced issues brought forth by this novel. The fact that consanguinity doesn't automatically give you insight into a culture and a history. And I do agree with the opinion that constant authenticity checking is just another form of gatekeeping. And there's no good reason to discourage someone from studying and discussing a racial issue just because they are not of that ethnicity. So overall, I do think this is a really fun read. It's written in very accessible language. It's a rather casual tone, so it's very easy to just quickly turn the pages, see what happens next, be taken on in this like journey of madness, and then after you put the book down, there's quite a lot to think about. Although at times the reading experience could start to feel like a doom-scrolling spiral, because the author, I think, did quite a good job of simulating that back and forth comment section rage war. But if you are someone who is trying to limit social media use, get away from that sort of language and that sort of mentality, at times you might be tempted to put the book down. And another kind of downside of the reading experience, which I did struggle with this author's other works, and that is kind of in the entire cast of characters, I didn't really find anyone that's particularly likable. So I don't know how you feel about this type of characterization work on the part of a fiction writer. I personally really want to see someone that I can root for and just like cheer on, but there's not really anyone like that in this story. But despite those issues, I would still recommend this book. I think it does give a great insight into the publishing industry, and it did kind of force me to think harder about how much we are influenced by polarizing opinions online. And it did offer some pretty interesting discussions about cultural appropriation, tokenism, and gatekeeping. Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. So this is the sequel to Parable of the Sower, which I read in February. That one was already a very dark speculative fiction, but somehow in this one things became even more bleak, even darker. So this is the second installment in a duology, and I really recommend you read both books. I will try to be a little bit brief and vague about the plot points in both books, so as to avoid spoilers. So Parable of the Sower follows Lauren Oya Olamina. The story starts when she is 15 years old. She is a sharer. That means she has hypersympathy syndrome, so she is capable of feeling other people's physical pain. She used to live in this cul-de-sac with her family, but a sequence of events happened that forced her to leave. This is kind of a coming-of-age story combined with a dark speculative fiction. So she starts from a 15-year-old girl and starts growing into an adult and witnessing the reality of this very dark world of extreme climate disasters, very intense water shortage, and high crime, high social instability, and a lot of exploitation happening. I remember one of the details in the first book being that it rains so rarely and so unreliably that a lot of people would rather not fix leaks in their roof so they can collect rainwater that leaks through the roof and then they can drink or use that water because it is so scarce and expensive and difficult to acquire. There is also blatant slavery in the universe created by this duology. And that bleak reality becomes intensified in Parable of the Talents. So the main timeline of this story takes place in a background of the pox, which is how people refer to the apocalypse, where there's practically total collapse of the climate, the economy, and social stability. So basically, the United States is just completely fallen apart. Now, Lauren has somewhat established a community for herself. They have this religion called the Earth Seed, which believes that God is change and humanity's fate is to take root among the stars. However, something horrendous happens to this small community that she has established. So I would say Parable of the Talents has a bit more of a sci-fi leaning compared to Parable of the Sower. There's a lot more references to technology, technological advances. However, these technological advances are used in the worst way possible. Instead of bettering people's lives, you see these like advanced remote controlled shock collars that are used to enslave people. And there's also some kind of knockout gas that also contributes to that purpose. And there are these armored vehicles called maggots that are very bulletproof. They serve a very dark purpose for extremists who are trying to enslave others. I think this story is a stark warning of what might happen to society if people are ruled by fear, if people cannot see economic opportunities to better their lives, and if a government confounds itself with religious extremism and it wages unnecessary wars rather than upholding the welfare of their citizens. It is very chilling to think about how the United States of today might be closer to this dark speculative reality than in the 90s when this book was written. And I would like to read you a quote from chapter 11 that I think would show you why it is even more important to read this duology today. Choose your leaders with wisdom and forethought. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control the fool. To be led by a thief is to offer up your most precious treasures to be stolen. To be led by a liar is to ask to be lied to. To be led by a tyrant is to sell yourself and those you love into slavery. I think this theology is a really stark warning of what might happen to a nation and a society when people just vote out of fear and fall for empty promises of quick fixes. And I certainly hope that this remains a warning rather than a prophecy. Circe by Madeline Miller. This book is about the goddess Circe from Greek mythology. She is the daughter of Helios. She is an immortal nymph, and she has the power of witchcraft. Although she is not the only one who has this kind of power among her siblings, she confessed to seeking it out willingly, and that angered Zeus, who exiled her to the island of Aiaia. During her exile, she lived among tame wolves and lions, perfected her craft, and met a number of gods and mortals, including Medea and Jason, Daedalus, and most notably Odysseus. I did really enjoy the setting of this story, the lush green islands and the surrounding seas. I thought it was a very escapist kind of read. And I do think the author did a very good job of characterization, especially these mythological figures that you kind of only know a couple facts of. And to me, at least in my mind, as someone who hasn't really studied mythology in depth, before reading this book, I did think of them as rather faceless figures that I have to remember a few facts of just to understand tropes and canons in Western literature. But the author did a very good job making these figures come to life. For example, the cunningness of Hermes the messenger, the god Helios being Circe's father, but also having just very little empathy for his children. He's a rather cruel god. And Daedalus and Odysseus being two mortals that Circe were fond of, having some similar qualities, especially at first glance, but then developed into very distinct characters. Daedalus being a very steadfast father who is also devoted to his craft, and Odysseus being a little bit more wily, especially after going through war and being so far away from home. That being said, I do have some dissatisfactions with this narrative, some of it due to my expectation being set incorrectly by some of the synopses I've read, saying that this is a retelling of the Odyssey through Circe's perspective. I found that to be a little bit inaccurate because I would say that this is more about the personal history of Circe, including her interaction with Odysseus and what she learned about the Odyssey. Odysseus doesn't appear until the second half of the book. The first half was mostly about her history as a nymph, what she encountered in the halls of the gods, and the circumstances of her exile, how she encountered some other mythological figures, including Medea, Jason, Hermes, and Daedalus, and so on. And her direct interaction with Odysseus lasted very short in this book. So in the Odyssey itself, Odysseus was supposed to spend a year on Circe's island, spending time with her, but that part felt very truncated in the narrative. And what Circe ended up learning about the Odyssey was mostly through secondhand recounting of the experience, either from Odysseus or later on in the story from other sources. So having seen the synopsis describing this as a retelling of the Odyssey, I guess my expectation was for it to be a little bit more epic, and I kind of wanted to see more action, but most of the story ended up feeling kind of internal to the island of Aiaia, and I felt like it was a bit constrained, even domestic at times, which was really not my expectation. So overall, I really appreciated how the author portrayed various mythological figures with very vivid, very distinct personalities, but I didn't love how most of the action in the narrative was a secondhand recounting of these actions that Circe heard from others while being very confined in a rather domestic space. The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. This story is about a teenage boy called Theo Decker who was unfortunately caught in an explosion at the Metropolitan Museum. He also lost his mother in this incident. However, during the chaos of the explosion, a famous painting called the Goldfinch fell from its frame, and Theo picked up the painting and ran out of the museum. So this story follows the coming of age of Theo, him having to hide this painting throughout much of his young life because he's really not supposed to be in possession of it. And we see him interacting with different people, surviving various situations thanks to the kindness of strangers, and the growing pains of an orphaned child and the uncertainty of his life. So I started reading this story in the middle of January and I finally finished it in March. Now, when I first started reading, I took note of Donna Tartt's writing being very detailed. She was very good at describing sort of every sight and sound and smell. So in a way, you kind of feel like you are living in the protagonist's mind, and everything he experiences becomes a first-hand experience almost for the reader. So that, I think, really is a great strength of her writing. Well, not only is she great at describing physical feelings, she is also amazing at writing mental and emotional feelings, especially when it comes to how Theo is processing becoming an orphan, what that implicates for his life, and how various people around him receive him after this situation, and how their behavior really deeply impacted him. She also wrote some very amazing passages regarding love and how deeply one can love another person and the unique kind of pain that that brings. This being said, at times I feel like there are too many details when it comes to sensations and environmental details and internal thoughts. Back when I was first reading about the explosion and how Theo experienced every second of that traumatic event, I thought it painted a very vivid scene, and it was a great, engaging, engrossing reading experience. However, not every moment in this novel is explosive. Increasingly, I started feeling like I really don't need to know every single detail through a character's eyes. Things that he sees around the city or along a canal in Amsterdam, or like every single decorative detail in a cafe that he sits down in. I feel like the author's almost obsessive insistence of including every single narrative moment and describing every detail is really weighing this story down, and at times it felt a little bit bloated. So the story is called The Goldfinch, but after Theo acquired this painting, the painting itself didn't really become a plot point until near the last third of the story. So this book is 771 pages long, and after Theo acquired this painting in the beginning, in part 1, where the museum explosion was written, the painting itself didn't really become an exciting plot point until page 480 onwards. So really, the story didn't really revolve around the painting until about the last third. The great length in the middle is just dedicated to Theo finding different situations to live, his interactions with others after becoming an orphaned child, and just like moment-to-moment interactions and dialogues with these people. Now, some of them, especially Boris, whom he met in Vegas, ended up becoming a very crucial figure regarding the fate of this painting later on in the story. But a lot of the other people that he met and interacted with did not really end up impacting the fate of the painting all that much. So I really did feel like a lot can be trimmed from this story without really losing the essence of the story, especially the later part of part 1 and part 2 and 3 of the story, and largely the beginning of part 4. So really, after the painting became like a central point of contention, I was pretty much binging through the rest of the story from page 480-ish towards the end. But the part before that was what took most of my time, just sort of dilly-dallying and Some days, even just forgetting to read this story, I feel like that should tell you how much the pacing of the story, especially in the first and second third of the story, really needed some tightening up. But setting aside the critique that I have about the pacing, I would say that the prose is very, very good in this writing. Like I said, Donna Tartt is very good at crafting individual details and really putting the reader into the mental space of the protagonist. The sentences are very well written and they flow together well. And once you really hit a stride with the narrative, there's a very nice cadence and rhythm to it. So overall, this is a very literary piece of writing. I would say the stylistic polish and the development of the character Theo definitely took precedence over the plot itself. Girls' adventure stories of long ago. So these are 7 different stories written by 7 different authors, all of them women, and they all featuring girls' experiences at various times of history spanning the 17th to the 19th century in Europe. Many prominent historical events and figures were featured in this book. For example, the French Revolution, Florence Nightingale's efforts in the Crimean War, and the suffragette movement for women. It was really interesting learning more about these historical figures and events. For example, during the French Revolution, there was this real sense of mob justice where people who have been oppressed and exploited for very long kind of just wanted to seek violence and revenge. And many innocent people were actually targeted and imprisoned. So there was a stretch of the French Revolution that was particularly bloody and rather murky when it comes to whether it was true justice or not. And I found the writing style of these stories very accessible. I think it's possible that they were rather targeting middle grade level of readers. That, combined with the beautiful illustrations included throughout the book, made it a very enjoyable, very easy kind of reading process. Mickey 7 and Antimatter Blues by Edward Ashton. So this duology was a surprise read for me in March. I didn't originally plan for them in my TBR. I was originally planning to just mostly read women's fiction for Women's History Month, but I saw the film Mickey 17 being released, and then I did a little bit of digging and found that the film was actually based on these books. However, I was a little bit miffed of, I kind of was watching videos about the film and then found it in a comment section of someone mentioning that it was based on these books. I did not see the author or the source material being referenced in the film's official promotion campaign. Like, I did not see the duology or the author mentioned in any of the articles that I've read about the film or like interviews of Bong Joon-ho or Robert Pattinson. So yeah, as a book lover, I was a little bit miffed that they made a film based on these books, but they didn't really seem to credit this author a whole lot. So I did review and compare the books and the film in another video already. In that video, I mainly focused on the similarities and the differences between the film and its source material. I will link it down below. So I will briefly go over them for you in this wrap up. It's actually quite heavy to hold 2 books in one hand, so let's do one at a time. This story opens with Mickey Barnes waking up in a frozen crevice, and he communicates with his colleagues Berto and Nasha that he doesn't really think he could be rescued, and indeed they kind of give up on rescuing him. We soon find out that Mickey is a expendable, meaning that he just often goes on these missions with high risk of death, and when he does die, they will just print out another copy of him. We learn that he is the only expendable member on the spaceship Drakkar that is heading to the planet Niflheim to establish a new space colony of human beings. So Niflheim is a frozen planet with quite toxic air and very low oxygen levels. So they can't really survive outside of the spaceship yet. And whenever they leave, they need to wear a rebreather to help them breathe. And on this planet, there is this native species called the creepers, which are quite scary. They have like multiple segments on their body, they have a lot of legs, they have mandibles on their heads. And throughout this book and throughout Antimatter Blues, we find out a lot more about what the creepers are, how they work, how they view sort of individual members of their species, how their nest work as a community, and how they, I guess, like project that a little bit onto human beings and how that impacted their interactions with human beings. But something really miraculous happened in Mickey Seven's interaction with the creepers, and he actually did not die in that frozen crevice. And when he returned to his room on the spaceship, he found out that they had already printed out a copy of him, which is Mickey 8. And they are really not supposed to coexist as two copies of the same human. And the author gives you the backstory of exactly why that is. So I would say that the main plot points, or like the main storylines of Mickey 7 was just Mickey 7 and 8 trying to avoid being found out that they are copies. They try to avoid being seen at the same time in the same space on a very small, cramped spaceship of nearly 200 people. And the other main component of the story is just trying to figure out what the creepers are and what they want and how to deal with them, which I would say continues on in Antimatter Blues. The narrative structure of this book is quite interesting in that the author kind of established a timeline sequence of actions in the first chapter, and then every other chapter alternates to an exposition of the backstory of this expedition and the planet Niflheim, all of the other spacefaring history of people leaving Earth, establishing colonies in space, and various space stations and spaceships. So you would kind of be following the present timeline, I would say, in chapter 1, and then in chapter 2 it jumps to backstory, and then in chapter 3 it comes back to the present, and you keep following the same sequence of events that was initiated in chapter 1, and then I think chapter 4 or chapter 5 like jumps back again. And this continues on throughout the whole book, and I don't think I remember ever seeing another book that is written quite like that. It was interesting to start, but then it did get a little bit tiring because I felt like I was constantly being put on hold while I was trying to enjoy the story. But if you don't like what I just described, I can tell you that book 2 does a lot less of that. I think there's only 2 flashbacks. So book 2 is very tightly paced, very linear page turner. So actually, in terms of just the reading experience, I actually preferred Antimatter Blues to Mickey 7 because it's so easy to follow, and it has some like further development of the characters. You really see Mickey Barnes developing as a character, and there's a new character called Speaker introduced in Antimatter Blues, and I found him quite cute, and I really like that character. So speaking as someone who doesn't actually read a lot of sci-fi and only recently made a resolution to read more sci-fi this year, I had a lot of fun reading this duology. I think the world building and the character creation are both quite good. The story is written in accessible language, and there's quite a bit of humor peppered throughout the series. A lot of the dialogues are quite funny, and a lot of the situations that Mickey finds himself in are quite absurd. So if you enjoy a little bit of nihilism and dark humor, I really think this is the duology for you. And the author did add in a slightly more serious philosophical query of whether a human that uploads his memories into a different body can still be considered the same human. He uses the ship of Theseus analogy, where if an explorer takes a ship to sea and the parts start breaking down, so he starts replacing them on the way and come home with every part on the ship replaced, is that still the same ship? So what should we think of, I guess, a human equivalent of the ship of Theseus? I mean, this is not the first sci-fi story that theorizes the possibility of storing and uploading human memory and the possibility that it can be somehow transferred into another body after the human being's death. But I do think that this is a worthy query. And I think it probably adds a little bit more philosophical depth to the books compared to the film. So those were the great books that I read in March, the vast majority of them being women's fiction. These books took me around the world and across centuries, from ancient Greece to 18th and 19th century France and England to present day Ireland and the United States. I had so much fun reading these stories. So as you can probably tell, I filmed these wrap-up reviews in a number of different sessions. I pretty much try to sit down and talk about the books that I finished as soon as I finish them. And now I'm editing and compiling all of them into a monthly wrap-up. So for April, I am considering just editing and posting the individual review sessions as soon as they are ready. So I might do like 3 or 4 weekly or bi-weekly reviews depending on how things go. Please subscribe and turn on notification to not miss a future review or recommendation. And please let me know in the comments below what you've read for March, whether you've enjoyed them, whether you've made amazing reading plans for April, and what you're currently reading right now. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.